Yeah, Jorge, regarding your visit, I don't think we may come to Switzerland and back. You can come at any time to us, but I'm not sure that the US will take you back, given the infections rate I'm expecting over the summer.
I know. I think I would only go up to yes, exactly. So I get
I think fall is fall of November.
that would be a trick on my family. It's like, oh, sorry, my wife has to take care of the kids now for 2 weeks until I can.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Let's get started. We can chat a little bit afterwards if you wanna stick around, Jorge. Okay. So welcome to today's Virtual Digital Economy seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you. Our moderator today will be Uli Kaiser at the University of Zurich, and he will introduce the speaker in a second. I'm here to give you some organizational details. So if you have any clarifying questions throughout the talk, please send these to Uli in the chat window. He will unmute you so you can ask your question in person. If you prefer, you can of course also ask Uli to ask the question for you. We will collect questions for the QA after the talk in the same way, so don't hesitate at any time to send questions via the chat. Today's session will be recorded, so if you do ask a question yourself, you will appear in the recording on YouTube, probably for eternity. All right, I'm happy to hand over to Uli.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is also why Jorge is wearing the tie. He knew that he will be on YouTube forever. So welcome also from my side. I will try to collect and organize the discussion. And I'm happy to have, for the first time, met Jorge. Even though only virtually, he's one of the people you seem familiar with, but you never really met. But this is now we have met. It's also interesting for me. It's interesting because he does stuff that I'm also very interested in, namely startups and stuff that you can learn from textual data. And I was asked to keep it brief by Hannes and Christian, so I leave the floor to Jorge now.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you. Let me make sure I have the right microphone. I hope everybody can hear me well, but let me know if you cannot. Hi everybody. So I am wearing a tie. I'm teaching in a couple of hours, and I just realized that if I take it off, it will get wrinkly, and I decided to keep it. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to Christian Haynes for inviting me, and Ulrich for being the moderator. Please do add your questions, and the more we can get through them, the better, and just keeps it more exciting. So the paper that I'm showing you today, it's a paper called Measuring Founding Strategy. This is joint work with Aishen Li, who is was a graduate student, a master's student in data science here at Columbia, and now he's admitted to the PhD program at Michigan, and he's still kind of waiting on that next step. So what are we going to be doing here? We're going to be talking about how can we measure the founding strategy of startups and its relationship to follow-on performance. And so to get to that, I'm going to give you a bit of a theoretical overview, not super theoretical, but just like set some stage. What do we mean by strategy? Why could it matter, et cetera? And then we're going to jump to an NLP approach that we use to measure founding strategy. Then I'll show you our data and empirical results and to a conclusion. So let me give you the theory before giving you a preview of the results. And it's fair to say that, conceptually, so Ulrich mentioned he does a lot of entrepreneurship work. I do as well. And it's fair to say that if there's one thing that has enamored the thinking around uncertainty for a long, long time, is this idea of entrepreneurship for a long, long time. It's this idea of uncertainty, right? This comes like, when you think about Frank Knight and the entrepreneur is able to deal with as a bearer of risk, and Schumpeter, when you think of entrepreneurship as this creative destruction process where there's equilibrium, and then sort of the entrepreneurs pierce through that and kind of get to the next level of success. At the level of strategy, right, it really has kind of created a sense that strategy should also focus on this idea of uncertainty. And so it's how do you face uncertainties if you're an entrepreneur, and how do you adapt and evolve in it? One piece that is sort of famous in this setting is this concept of dynamic capabilities, which is setting up an organization so that as the world changes, you kind of are still able to be on top and continue sort of being profitable and distinctive, et cetera. There's one dynamic capability that I think is sort of a focus of a lot of discussion nowadays, and this idea of experimentation, which is not kind of like the scientific experiments we do in research, but more like just when you have a hypothesis, don't jump to it, but validate it through data, and it's an active process of that. Here's Rita McGrath sort of explaining the view on the importance of these kind of adapting on uncertainty. She says, a strategy stuck. For too long, the business world has been obsessed with the notion of building a sustainable competitive advantage. Sustainable competitive advantage is now the exception, not the rule. And transient advantage is the new normal. Now, there's other work, of course, that kind of focuses on the importance of founding strategies and things, and kind of emphasizes that the stuff that's happening at founding actually predicts performance quite a bit, right? I have some stuff with Scott Stern showing that if you look at the filing registration of companies, like at the moment you go and say at the business registrar, I want to register a company, there's a bunch of stuff there or around that time that actually predicts success pretty well, sort of if you're registered in Delaware and a series of things. Kaplan-Stromberg and Sensoy, 2009, look at IPOs. And for example, that 2009 paper shows that when you actually look at successful startups, venture-backed startups, and what they say they're doing when they go IPO, right? So really at the top level of success. And you compare that to what they said previously that they were doing when they were starting to raise financing, there's actually huge similarities between the two. It's actually pretty persistent. And there's sort of other ideas there. And it really often focuses on these kind of Porter idea about differentiation, which, maybe you can summarize with this kind of note. Competitive strategy is about being different. And so when you think about, in those other cases, it's really about how the company's starting out, but also how it connects to the remainder of the competitive landscape, that it allows it to eventually be successful. Obviously, right, this is like a little bit of a false trade-off. It's, the reality has to be somewhere in the middle. It's both how you start and if you have potential when you're starting out, let's call that founding positioning, like sort of consistent with the idea of strategic positioning or founding strategic differentiation. And from there, if you learn and experiment, you will evolve and kind of find better or worse outcomes as well. And so rather than trying to say, well, what is it? Is it one or is it the other? Which is, I think, there's going to be a little bit of the middle. Maybe what you want to ask is, what is the relative importance of it, right? What is founding strategy and how much does it actually matter? The second piece, the founding piece, here's some questions you could ask around that. How may one statistically characterize the difference in the level of founding differentiation for startups, right? If competitive strategy is about being different, how do you observe that, right? What would be its role in predicting startup performance if you are actually able to understand whether startups are different from each other? Does it predict performance or not? That would serve this debate. More generally, how do you even measure this and how do you think about startup strategy? Before we get there, though, so that's where we're going. I think, it comes from the title, Measuring Founding Strategy. But before we get there, I actually want to take a step back and begin thinking about humans and ask ourselves, how do humans themselves or ourselves assess strategic differentiation, right? How do we do it? And then think of that, how can something like NLP actually relate to that? And so let me give you, it turns out that humans are actually pretty good at understanding strategic differentiation. And one way to do it is to look just at what the companies say about themselves, for example, in their marketing statements. So here's two companies, Delta and Southwest. Southwest says, here's Southwest slogan is low cost, low fares, nothing to hide. That's transparency. The Delta slogan is world's most trusted airline. Now it's easy for any analyst, for ourselves, a strategy analyst, to see the differences between these two, right? On the Southwest side, it's easy to see that it emphasizes that it's lower cost, that it's kind of transparent. It's trying to appeal to cost-sensitive customers tired of extra fees. On the Delta side, it does not emphasize low cost at all. It emphasizes that you can trust it, that it has wide coverage, and it's appealing to other set of people that just trying to get, where they want reliably and on time. And of course, if you actually look at the track record of Southwest, it's both very profitable, but also it's actually does not have great coverage. It's just some bunch of medium-sized cities. And it has very kind of very bad on-time departure cycles as well. And so it doesn't matter for Southwest because it's kind of appealing to this other set of customers. What I want you to see though, so these are two statements, we can state the differences. What I want you to see though is that if we had a third statement like Spirit, less money, more go, it's actually pretty easy to see, you know, not only that these two are different, but on which one of these two is Spirit with, you know, with a slogan like less money, more go impinging the most, right? It's clearly focused on low cost advantages, and therefore it's likely to compete closely with the Southwest value proposition. And so in this three company competitive landscape, I have shown you Southwest is less well positioned, less differentiated in the market than Delta at this point, and therefore, you know, it's sort of competing more. So that's basically what we're going to go after. You know, expand on this idea, but rather than just grabbing the slogans, grab a bigger set of marketing statements. For example, one marketing statement that's very common for basically all companies since a certain kind of point in time is to have a website. And the role of the website is to just explain what your company do for anybody that wants to listen. And if you were able to get all these marketing statements, would there be a way to actually map, just like we did with this tree, but more systematically, which ones are closer to each other? And more importantly, in this kind of conceptual map, which companies are a little bit more kind of by themselves, right? And if that being by themselves, we can think about that as market differentiation. And from there, measure its role, founding strategy, founding market differentiation on performance. So that's where we're going. We're going to get the marketing materials from the Wayback Machine. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Just so you know, though, this is completely online. It's there in the paper. All the code that we've written is there online. And it's just bit.ly/measuring founding strategy, or you can look at my GitHub. Either way, if you want to do anything of what we did here, except for the underlying Crunchbase data that we're going to use, all the code is there, and it's definitely, you know, everybody's free to use it. The key insight that we're going to build on from this idea is what I just told you. Most startups within a certain kind of type of startup actually get a website pretty early on. And so what we're going to do is, can we use natural language processing, machine learning, to try to measure now the distance in the founding websites of startups, right, to try to understand founding strategy. We're going to measure the distance using what's called a word embeddings approach. And most companies, you know, this is pretty kind of natural. But we're going to see they're not actually related, right? And so we're going to develop a more thoughtful way than the average distance of everybody to really looking at how far away are you from your closest competitors. We're going to aggregate this in a single score of how far away are you from your closest competitors, the strategic differentiation score, which is about this idea of market differentiation, right? And we're going to find that we're just going to see this is truly a measure that we're validating empirically. This is not a causal statement. These are really kind of comparative statics, right, of the relationship of founding strategy and performance. We're going to see a lot of variation on the strategic differentiation of firms at founding. We're going to find that it predicts early stage performance in financings, as well as late stage performance in equity, in equity growth events. And, I'll tell you about the dynamics. They appear to be consistent with other things we know about disruptive companies. Differentiation from incumbents seems to be what predicts performance, not from other startups. So it seems to be more about how do you compare to the existing market structure than other startups seeking financing. And then we're going to do some variance analysis to show that founding strategy accounts for 21 to 25% of variance in outcomes. And so the takeaway, it's sort of this idea of how do you measure founding strategy? How does it predict performance? And how much statistically does it appear to matter? Questions so far? Any thoughts? Ulrich, anybody?
Nothing yet in the chat.
Let me get to the chat here. Okay. Oh, okay, nothing yet. All right. There we go. How much do we think founding strategies? That's a great question, right? How is this marketing or not? And it's interesting, right? This is why, this is not all of founding strategies, but rather just market differentiation or market positioning. Marketing seems to be about a lot more than the value proposition you're offering to consumers, right? And so to the extent that, we think those two overlap, which I'm pretty sure they do, then it makes sense. But once you think about placement in channels and product and not right in pricing, etc., that's not as well captured in the strategy per se. Thank you. Okay, so if you have followed anything in this literature using NLP, see how companies are different, see how that relates to performance, then you must be pretty familiar with a pretty seminal paper in this area called Text-Based Network Industries and Endogenous Product Differentiation. It's a paper I like a lot, Gerald Holberg and Gordon Phillips. And so, one thing that I want to tell you as a small kind of parentheses is how our paper is different from this one, because it really is, amazing work, but it's actually different in some ways. What they do is they grab public companies, and from the annual reports, they grab the business description in the annual reports, and then basically do a similar approach of NLP and kind of differentiation, but rather than trying to understand how different you are, they do clustering, and they define kind of these clusters as industries, right? These are the text-based related industries, basically, and they find that these industries are actually pretty good at predicting different things that we know about industries, competitors, etc. As compared to like typical SIC codes, they actually perform a lot better. And so, if that's in your mind, I'll tell you a couple of ways this paper is actually quite different. The first one, of course, it's conceptually, there's a focus on strategy, not industry. Of course, these are related. There's a bunch of Michael Porter, Rommelt, and Schmelinski work going back to history, trying to understand how different and related they are. But of course, and being in an industry is part of your strategy, but they're also substantively related. In particular, strategy is about differentiating from your closest competitors, versus industry is about how do you group together in competition. Methodologically, we do a few things differently. The first one is we actually replicate this Holberg and Phillips approach within our website data. And we include fixed effects for all these clusters that I told you. So we can cluster our standard errors on that. So we can effectively, our results be conditional on their approach of text network related industries. And the second, our NLP model is going to be slightly more sophisticated in the sense that we account for context. We use word embeddings rather than TF-IDF. That sounds like a detail, but it turns out to really matter in terms of how much can these measure predict performance. Turns out that the typical TF-IDF, I'll tell you all about how it works in just a second, actually only accounts about 4% of the variance in outcomes, in the word embeddings model a lot more. And finally, of course, from a data perspective, we're focusing on these founding websites and all the associated code that you can go ahead and find in our website. We're focused on founding websites and startups rather than public companies. Okay, so there's the link, by the way. So anybody interested in using our approach, all the link is there, all the code is there. That's how the kind of GitHub works. Pretty simple. Okay, so let me give you the 4 sort of key insights that allow our methodology. First insight, I think I already kind of explained this, but I'll explain it again, is that firms state their value proposition in marketing statements. Firms may not state this perfectly, and we could go about around, but that's a key assumption here that I think is by and large true. When firms write marketing statements, they're actually doing a pretty intentional thing to explain to consumers what this company is all about, right? And so looking at those and taking them seriously would allow you to understand something about where this firm is in the market. Second, then this is where, that the first thing we showed about with Southwest and Delta. Second, the similarity in these statements can indicate some sort of substitutability or competition in the market. We saw Southwest and Spirit, and how sort of similarity in these statements actually does, if you're a little bit familiar with these companies, they're actually much more substitutable amongst themselves. And so seeing that can be useful. Third, we're mostly done a conceptual approach, but actually measuring distance amongst statements is not a theoretical idea. They're actually pretty standard text analysis algorithms. So let me do a small deep dive there. What you're thinking, obviously, is this idea that similarity is a function of 2 statements. And so, here we call it sigma ij. if the sigma ij is equal to 1 is if two statements are completely equivalent, and sigma ij equal to 0 if two statements are completely different. And obviously, most similarities sort of in between. Where word embeddings is a little bit of a newer method. It's not the newest method, by the way. But what it's trying to do is, I think is trying to take advantage of a series of the context in which a word is used to assess how much to weigh it. What do I mean? Well, I mean, if we all tried to do like these text similarity measures, we would all come up with a naive version that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Like maybe like how many words you use, how often compared to other documents, as well as maybe weigh the more rare words more, right? Like words that are very common should have a low weight. And that's the classic way we do it. TF-IDF, the thing that I showed you before, it's basically a sophisticated implementation of that. Word2Vec doesn't only do that, but also now uses sort of what's called a neural network to have 100 characteristics per word, right? Rather than just how common it is and how often you use it, that's 100 characteristics per word, or you can change this number, but let's say 100 for now, since it's the number we use, and it's the standard, like sort of the default. And we and it uses the incidence of other words to kind of build those characteristics. And so, for example, if you have a certain value, then the fact that these other words are being used around it sort of also adds meaning to that. And then when you compare the similarity between documents, you don't have one weight per word based on how common it is and how often you use it, but rather you have 100 characteristics per word based on how you use it on across the context. And so that allows a lot more richness in this similarity. Now that sounds potentially complicated, but actually that was actually super easy because I said these are pretty standard. Here's all the code we had to write. You remove stop words, create a tag document, which is like a Python library, then append them all, then run doc2vec, document equal the documents I just made. So it was super easy. This sort of word window is a 5. This is standard, no corpus file. It's also by default, the default distributed memory algorithm and the default number of features. So we took this sort of a pretty vanilla implementation of these. I am sure, if there's some enterprising person out there that would like to learn, I'm sure there's like tuning of these would be like sort of an additional benefit. How much is unclear. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now, the fourth insight, and I already told you about this as well, is that the idea of observing some of these statements at founding is possible through archival websites. Websites represent a de facto marketing channel for virtually all firms founded after a certain date. And here we're going to use firms founded, I think, after 2005. And so it's sort of basically for all growth-oriented firms, one of the things you do when you're starting out is you go and like set up your website, right? And we're going to use this tool called the Wayback Machine. Let me give you a sense of what that tool looks like. So this is the Wayback Machine is created by the Internet Archive, archive.org. It is a company whose main job, it's an organization, a nonprofit, whose main job is to capture the history of the internet as it is at specific periods of time. For example, if I go there right now, I can find all versions of my website. I can also find 14,600 copies of Columbia.edu, for example. You can see here in the date distribution that there's a lot of them. So let me give you an example, right? So here's Grubhub. It's a company founded in 2004. This is, its description in this startup data set called Crunchbase, which we're going to use. And you can see it's founded in 2004. You can see today it's public. It's actually, raised a ton of funding, etc. Here's the set of snapshots we have in the Wayback Machine. You can see sort of around 2003, 2004, the Grubhub founders, besides founding the company, kind of set up their website. And you can, each blue dot that you see here is one date when they got a snapshot, when sort of Wayback Machine got a snapshot of Grubhub. And you can see there's a lot of them. Each green dot just, it's like a HTTP error. Don't worry about those. And so initially, then you just go to his website and click on it. And what you find, for example, here's August 9th. Here's how Grubhub looked in August 9th. It has a lot of similarities. If you use Grubhub in the US, it's this meal delivery service. It has a lot of similarities in that it's still focused on food, but some differences, right? It's a lot more a directory than a place to order food, as well as it's sort of basically focused on Chicago rather than in the US. So some similarities, some differences. Here's how it looks like in 2012, right? 8 years later, a lot closer to where it is today, but still sort of, still focused on online ordering. So it was, but now this was, right, this was about who does delivery for my location. You would select your location, it would tell you. This is more, already includes a lot more online ordering features and sort of a lot more, this looks like a little bit of an old style of web pages, right? Here's how it looks like today, a lot more recent, a lot more that kind of thing. And so what we're going to do, right? There's our code. If anybody wants to see our code, we're very proud of our code. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at all startups and we're going to do these. Now, what I just showed you, we're just going to go grab their founding date from Crunchbase. And we're going to look, this is just like, one convention we came up with, which let's get the earliest snapshot in Crunchbase in the Wayback Machine that occurs the year after being founded. So maybe, if the founding year, it's like a little bit tricky, or sometimes startups have there's a previous website that was also in the same domain, etc. So maybe we wait until like the earliest website available in the year after founding. And so, okay, so that so far allows us to measure this distance. Now, the last piece of our trick is, or of our algorithm is, how do you bring together this distance this distance is pairwise, right? It's between all companies and each other. And so the question is, how do you bring this together into a single measure per company of how differentiated it is? And here we're going to use some heuristics that seem to work out very well. And so what we're going to do is, we all know it's about your closest competitors, but how many, that's the question, right? And I'm going to show you a lot about, also results for the one closest competitor, but our main measure is going to be about the 5 closest competitors. And the reason we use that is, there's this classic paper by Tim Bresnahan and Peter Rice that says, basically competitive dynamics are very different in these first 4 or 5 companies, but then they basically become a competitive market. So, here's what they have for competition amongst druggists and doctors and dentists and local markets. And you see there's a lot of kind of more profitability when it's just 1 company, 2 and 3, but after 5, basically it's equal to 1 in this ratio, which was their measure. Here is, Igami and Watake, they studied something different lately, which is the impact of competition and innovation. And they find that, when a company is by itself, they innovate less and the competitive dynamics really kick in, but sort of by the fifth competitor, it doesn't make a lot of difference. And so it does seem, based on these 2 pieces of evidence that there's something about these kind of first 3 to 5 competitors that really shapes competitive dynamics. And so those are the ones we're going to pick. We're going to do then the average distance to your 5 closest competitors. So that was a lot. I'm moving into my data, but I would be happy to hear any questions, or should I move on? What do you think, Ulrich?
There was one more question about the way you account for the length of the statements in the similarity measurement. Right, I guess there's more words, and so there can be more similarity if there's more words, and there's less similarity if there are longer words.
Yeah, so that is a great question, Quilly. Thank you so much. I'll show you. It is true, right? It is true. Websites don't have the type of variation that we focus on the first 10 web pages we could download, of course, because sometimes there are listings that can have 1,000 pages. We didn't have as much of that variation, but I'll actually show you some robustness tests around that, because that could certainly be a concern. Not only the length and similarity, but also that, I don't know, maybe that is correlated with companies with higher potential, right? More, I don't know. And so that's a great question. Thank you so much. Let me show you in just a second when we get to results validations around that.
Okay. So then there's another question from Hannes. Sorry.
So Hannes has a great question.
It's good we have a discussion. That's not so easy to get started normally on virtual seminars. So let's keep it going. So when do you observe competitors on Crunchbase?
That is a great point, Hannes, because it's really, there's one thing I have not spoken about. It's sort of weird, right? I tell you a methodology, and I've been talking about startups so far, but most of if I'm inventing like a teddy bear you can hug, most of my competition is based on Disney and other big companies. And so what we're actually going to do, and I guess I'm getting into our data, but I'll tell you now, what we're actually going to do is we're going to compare a startup to two populations. First, we're going to compare it to all other startups founded in the same year. But we're also going to compare it to all public companies that are listed in the same year. And we're going to go to those public companies and get their website in the year the startup was founded. Does that make sense? So it's how do you compare? And that's actually our preferred measure, because that's really about differentiation in the market. Of course, the market is not all public companies. It's not just public. But as a good proxy, if you grab all public companies and you look at their website and say, what are these companies doing at the time I'm starting out, right? And then try to understand distance from that. That feels like maybe a good measure of market differentiation. I'll show you that's actually the piece that matters rather than the startup piece. That actually turns out to be much less.
So the population from which you draw, this is all in Crunchbase, but that also means that these are all firms that have equity financing at some point, right?
That is absolutely correct. So there's two, right? Not all companies. I mean, Crunchbase is a sort of crowd-funded platform. So not everybody. You don't need equity financing to add yourself to Crunchbase, but it certainly selects on companies that have certain kind of possibilities of that. I think that's useful, and that's useful together with public companies because it allows us to focus on kind of traded industries, you might say. Industries where competition occurs at the national level, perhaps, and all these companies can be thought about like that. If we focus on local companies, say, taco shops, then location and distance dynamics actually become a lot more important, and we don't incorporate that into the way we attack this problem. Okay, so let me tell you about the data. I just foreshadow a little bit of what is going to go on here. So I talked about growth-oriented startups in Crunchbase. We're also, I guess I had further here. We're also going to use Preqin to get all the public companies and their websites listed at that time. And so we're going to use these two measures, right? Everything with the Wayback Machine. So we're not using any information like in the 10Ks or anything like that. It's just comparing websites to websites, as we mentioned. Here's a little bit of the information of these companies. We're ultimately able to capture 13,000 companies. We had about 26, and here or there we couldn't get the website. The website was too short, and so it was like 200 characters, coming soon. Maybe the founding dates are not consistent. We get 13,000 companies. 66% of them have something we call early stage financing, which is either a seed round that's written or a angel round or a grant. Christian is asking if we scrape all URLs. We scrape the landing page and the first 10 URLs we can get. Once we get to 10, we stop. And the reason is that if you can see, for example, this Grubhub website, it's pretty clear to see that if you do a full scraping, you're basically never going to end, right? Because it's just and so we stop at the 10 websites. We don't put any priority on which 10. We just kind of go down the list as they kind of come up. So wait, right? 30% of them get Series A VC financing, 15% of them are acquired, and 2% of them IPO. These, maybe this is one outcome. Equity growth is 17%, which is IPO or acquisition. And so we're really going to look at, I'm going to show you our measure. I'm going to tell you some details about it, and then I'll show you how does it predict these two outcomes, getting early stage financing as well as Series A, and then equity growth outcomes. That is also useful, to Ulrich's point, because it's actually much harder to see like things like profit and things like that. And so, this is like, but we do know that sort of companies getting into Crunchbase are expecting to grow and succeed in this type of equity outcome. And so that makes it a little bit more useful. Okay, so let me show you our results. So I'm going to show you these four things, right? First, our measure. This is the distribution, right? Ample distribution by company in their strategic differentiation score. Remember, this is the closest distance to your 5 closest companies. And so if you're all the way to the right, you have the most distance. You're the most differentiated to your top 5 public firms, in the same way to the to the other side. Here's some of the correlations. The distance to the top closest public firms and to the 1 closest public firm, that's 1 and 2. They're pretty correlated. I think that's expected. distance to the top closest startups, and one close startup. They're also pretty correlated, but much less. I think that also makes sense. Much less to the public piece. I think that also makes sense. Let me give you some examples though, because I think it's interesting to try to think, what does this even mean? Here's the score. Here's like an examples of the food industry, like maybe a non-tech industry. I'll show you a tech industry in a bit. And how they score in this like the differentiation score they get, and the percentile that they rank in that score, the company, and the short description that they had written in Crunchbase. Okay, and so at the top, we're seeing things that to me feel differentiated, right? These are jicama chips, world's first. So they're claiming sort of something very unique. Whereas, right, and together with that, Ripe.io is creating the blockchain of food. I have no idea what that is. I don't know if it's going to succeed, but it's certainly differentiated. And at the bottom, we see stuff that's pretty standard, right? Big box overstocks. We see imported seaweed, which is a little bit better. Seaweed seems to be sort of a topic here, as well as creating foods and beverage. And so here's what the jicama chips look like. I've never tried them, so I'm actually curious. But it gives you a sense, at least in this validation, that it feels like the distribution is consistent. Aisha is asking, how are you thinking about incumbents but privately held firms? We actually are not able to capture that. Absolutely, that's a big limitation of our approach. And you would hope that if you were able to capture, presumably you could go and, scrape every website in the world or something, but we're not able to capture that. And because we didn't know what would be the right set to choose, but I'm sure there's ways to do that. Forbes, I don't know. And it could be a great thing we could do forward for sure. Here's consumer electronics, so a lot more tech oriented, right? And at the top, we again have Perihug. Perihug is a parable Wi-Fi enabled teddy bear that lets you hug someone from anywhere in the world. Again, that's how it looks, by the way. You can have fun looking at it. You may or may not think that this is a good idea, but certainly looks very differentiated. Lark is the leading digital health company using AI and clinical science to deliver scalable positive health outcomes. And again, more to the middle, we have things like Pranksy, slide sharing application, and moving to the bottom, right, warranty management. So we are seeing our measure match the type of kind of intuitive sense we would expect from this type of measure. All right, so let me go ahead. I guess we're running out of time until 12:45. Let me move quickly through these ones so I can get to the questions. These are some bin scatters, but let me actually move to regressions instead. So here's our main differentiation score, right, where we're focusing on these 5 public firms. It obviously predicts and the dependent variable is, do you get early stage financing? I'll show you the extensive margin in a second. This is the intensive margin in a second. Obviously, the coefficient is huge. Now, a lot of that is related to these, industry life cycles, as well as it turns out that a huge difference kind of drops when you include industry fixed effects. And this makes sense, right? It drops about 60%. It turns out, if you go and look at the literature about how much industry versus strategy matter in the classic papers, 60% is not far away from where they put the number of industry versus other things. And so it felt very consistent for us, just kind of the right magnitude. This is we add more stuff, not just industry and year, but actually year by state, if you feel something is happening at the state level, as well as city fixed effects, it remains stable. Actually, let me just go back here because the question had come up. We also do sometimes a website length control, just the length of the website, and we include sort of 20 bins of that length as fixed effects, just getting back to Quilly's question, and we also see that it doesn't seem to matter as much. So we see the same on the extensive margin, right? We get, let me focus on this regression, which is my preferred regression, which is found here in industry fixed effects. This coefficient is, again, pretty large. It suggests, for example, that, and we see it for this early stage financing or Series A or the other ones. For our measure, moving from the 10th to the 90th percentile measure, predicts that this startup would eventually raise 25% more early stage financing and 50% more Series A financing. And so these are pretty meaningful levels of change based on variation in this early stage financing measure. Second, right, this is against the startups, right? What this is sort of other measures. We see that the 5 closest firms and one close firm, the kind of coefficients are actually pretty close. But when you look at the 5 closest startups or the 1 close startup, they're actually not positive, right? One of them is negative, the other one is noisy. And so it seems like, if you think this has something to do with the VC market and differentiating, it really seems to me at least that it's not about differentiation to other startups, raising money, etc., but rather something about these positioning versus incumbents, consistent with this idea of kind of market differentiation. And you can see other validations there if you include them together, which one turns positive, etc. So this is one angle, right? The early stage, you're well differentiated. Do you raise more money initially? The other angle is, of course, do you eventually succeed more? And so again, here are some scatter plots. Let me jump to our regressions because these are a little bit more nuanced. First, here's the first coefficient, right? Again, we in this case, we actually don't see a massive positive relationship. We see a coefficient that is not that small, right? It's still like 15% of the mean. And the p-value is maybe like 0.14, but it's kind of not quite significant. The second piece, we include one control, which is mean industry growth, which is, I told you that we do these these HP industries of your related ones, and is how likely were the other startups that are kind of in your cluster, how likely were they to succeed? And once you control for that, we get a little bit more significance. We use the method I showed you, and again, it's a little bit noisy, as well as the other ones. Here's other validations we do, because this starts to get puzzling, and I'll show you why. It's going to make sense in just a minute. Here's other validations we do. We drop the youngest firms, right? So we drop all firms born 2016 or later. If you think there's something about the life cycle, maybe young firms, maybe differentiation matters differently between young and old firms, then you could get some of that, and it looks positive. We drop the low value acquisitions, just include kind of high value acquisitions and IPOs. It also seems more positive. And so this is kind of puzzling, right? And let me skip over these ones. But we actually had a hypothesis on these, and we actually were sort of expecting this may happen. And the reason is that what we're seeing here is that young companies, right? Young companies don't seem to benefit as, at the beginning of the life cycle, very differentiated companies don't seem to get that boost. But the ones that we're seeing over longer years, the ones that live 5-10 years, we are seeing the boost eventually. And so it turns out that the literature sort of predicts this, right? The literature on disruption, which is not the same as what we're doing here, but it's not unrelated. But for example, the literature on disruption says that very disruptive companies need to compete, and it's going to take a longer time. Matt Marks, Josh Gans, and David Chu have this paper. It's going to take a longer time to establish themselves in the market, to achieve this legitimacy. And so initially, we may not see the benefits, but over time, they may actually be more likely to succeed. And so if you look at so we applied it over age dynamics, and that was kind of our pattern, right? This is the cumulative likelihood of IPO. So it's not the year-based effect. And that's kind of what we see. Initially, very differentiated companies are not IPOing within 1 year, within 2 years, actually. They're not getting acquired immediately. It makes sense. They're doing something that's very disruptive and unique. But over time, they're actually a lot more likely to be acquired or to succeed. And so, or to IPO. And actually, if you observe these companies over 10 years, you would see that companies that move from a 10 to 90% of our measure are 26% in terms of compared to the mean value, kind of 26% more likely to IPO and 31% more likely to be acquired. So that seemed like pretty meaningful measures, and actually on both kind of outcomes. I have 1 minute. Let me get you to the last measure that we have here, last analysis, which is, well, how much of the variance can we explain? I show you relationship to outcomes, but how much of the variance can we explain? We're going to use a simple approach, right, which is out of sample predictions. We're going to grab our measure. We're going to do tenfold validation, if anybody's familiar with it. It's like you grab 9 chunks of the data and you train a model on that and predict on the other one, and then you keep swapping which one is so you can have out of sample predictions, right, from your model. And we're going to grab just our founding measures based on text and see right? And develop a prediction based on our founding measures of where you get financing or whether you can achieve this equity outcome. And so here's the financing. Basically, we see that firms that we predict based on founding that are likely to succeed sort of are much more likely. So we lay out our firms, and firms in the bottom of that percentile are sort of about half as likely to succeed as bottom at the top of our predicted distribution. This is our preferred measure, kind of ROC scores, where we look at the area under the curve. Under this measure, we capture 25% of the variation of area under the curve. So, we interpret that as founding strategies able to account for 25% of the variation in in equity outcomes. Same thing for, being, again, for equity outcomes. The first one was financing outcomes. This one is equity outcomes. It just appears that it's able to predict, being at the bottom versus the top of our distribution leads to a 5x predicted value in terms of total financing, and we're able to account for 21% of the variation. Just so you get a sense of whether our approach was useful, here's the TF-IDF model in terms of equity outcomes and all that kind of fancy stuff we did with word embeddings and whether context matters. It actually, that TF-IDF doesn't predict a lot. Now, it has a little bit of a parallel to strategy. I'm not saying this is like what we capture, but it has a parallel in the sense that in strategy, we say it's not just using new things, but using them in unexpected ways. And so here's a little bit the version of that with words. It's not just using unique words, but using them in novel ways where we're seeing that. We control for industry. It goes up from 0.60 to 0.63, a little bit extra, but not sort of overpowers it. Okay, so that's all I had. I'm sorry I ran 1 minute late.
That's perfectly okay. Even by Swiss standards.
Yeah, okay, so this paper demonstrates, should I conclude or?
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Let me just review the conclusions just to this paper demonstrated an ability to measure strategic differentiation from founding statements. It was scalable. It is applied to firm and incumbent websites. There's many more applications to this code if anybody was interested in them. Results show that firms that measures of higher strategic differentiation predict raising early stage financing, more early stage financing, and whether a firm achieves equity outcomes. And our models show that we're able to account for 21 to 25% of the variation. There's some obvious extensions we're not doing. Of course, there's a sense, one piece is there's always this literature on optimal differentiation, where being really, really, really weird, like the Jicama chips and the RIPE.io blockchain of food, maybe too much. And so we're, there might be an optimal level. We don't focus on that in this paper yet. There's also something about pivoting, right? We could compare how the startup changes over time. We haven't studied that here either. But those are interesting extensions sort of for future work for sure. Thank you so much. So now, yeah.
Thank you, Jorge. I was a bit quick because there are many questions, and I think good questions also here. There's one that relates to the Crunchbase data. Kaushik asked why you don't use tags in Crunchbase. I don't know what it is. Maybe you.
Right. The Crunchbase categories, right? And that's a great question. We do have analysis where we use those as industry controls. It works the same. Here where I show you the food industry and the consumer electronics industry, those were, right, the category in Crunchbase called food and the category in Crunchbase. I think our concern was that the Crunchbase tags, we don't know when they're put in, right? And so they may be put in exposed as things rationalize themselves. For example, I could go today and tag some companies with something else about their market as I understand it today. And we really wanted to make sure that we just looked at information that was true and existent at the time of startup founding. But maybe there's better ways to use them for sure. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, and there's a block of questions brought up by Aya and Hannes and Jonathan about measuring competition. And I wanted to make Aya spokesperson, but I'm not sure I muted her. Did I?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. They're really, really cool work. And it's, on some level, it's surprising that you can actually describe something meaningful out of those founding websites. So that's really, really cool. As a starting point, kind of a surprising
that it even
demonstration. My question was about really kind of controlling for the industry conditions and going beyond the industry fixed effects and just structure, numbers of firms, concentration, and all that kind of thing. And I think your idea of thinking about the industry life cycle is really interesting because the differentiation might, I would think that differentiation might be less valuable in the beginning where there's a rapid growth and there's a few firms and everyone is kind of naturally sort of differentiated. And once it gets tighter, shake out, or they're starting to fight over smaller margins, and that's when being differentiated is really valuable. So to the degree that you could capture some of that, I think it would be really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think one piece where we were thinking it made sense to use this clustering approach, right, was just in the some of these things are better known at the SIC level than just how companies cluster from each other, was trying to take advantage of what was supposed to be a better measure of industry composition, and that was more conflicting with our approach, right? Because we're both using text, etc. And so that's why we use this one. But I absolutely agree. We could try to use these things, even within a cluster, we could look at the number of firms entering and exiting. If we connect it to the public firms and include those in the clustering, we could look at their profit margins and other things. And so I could only agree that those are all very good ideas. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and there's adding to this. So there's the question by Hannes and Jonathan about the selection of firms in Crunchbase, which these are firms mostly that have some equity financing. So that's not the population of firms. And maybe the takeaway you're mentioning is competitor maybe the local shop that is not listed anywhere, right? And I think that's a bit difficult to compare. But so that one solution may be that can you not use these business purpose statements because they're mandatory, at least for corporate firms? Instead, it's just very similar, right? I mean, you're using them anyway now, but just in Crunchbase.
Yeah, no, it is similar, right? I think there are certain things we liked about Crunchbase. One of them was that the companies list their website there. Just like our understanding, we had their equity outcomes and their website information and founding date all seem to be well packaged together. Another thing we liked was that we may be able to make a better assumption that these companies are not competing in the local ecosystem, right? I mean, if you're thinking about relevant competitors and you're like a barber shop, it's really like your location matters a lot, right? Your location matters a lot. And we didn't have that in the data. And, also that's the old Breshnahan paper, actually. It's like locations with the number of dentists and etc. And so we were really trying to focus on companies that are kind of traded or global or something like that, or at least at the US level. And so once we looked at venture-backed startups and public companies, we felt we could capture that sort of well, recognizing though that not all public companies trade everywhere in the US, of course, and things like that, but at least it would allow us to make that as a good initial assumption. So now you ask Ulrich on using other data sets, right? I do have that work on.
No, I think the worry is a bit that we all believe that you measure what you measure. That's adequate, but we're not so sure about the differences. So what are the appropriate firms to look at that they differentiate from? That's, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, the assumption is if you grab all public companies, that gives you a snapshot of the market, and then you can, how different are you from kind of the existing market when you're starting out? I agree that in the local sense, we're not able to capture local competitors. And I mean, I think what we think, right, is that our approach is very imperfect. So it's a little bit to Aishen's point that, like, it's surprising. This actually measures it that well in the sense that if you thought there's a lot of noise here, then you would feel like the true measure of strategy or something like that, which should just matter more and be better or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's a sample essentially, right? And
right, exactly. So it's a noisy measure for sure, right? Absolutely.
Yes. Then Hans has a dynamic question on the dynamics of the measure. Hannes.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could actually identify heterogeneity in your effects on these success measures, depending on how dynamic markets are, and I think specifically for later stage financing success. So, and I was thinking, I'm not sure if it's possible, but you could look at variation in the number of close or similar startups that are outside of the cohort that you use, to define these so I assume in some markets the year after or 2 years after you might have very similar startups coming in, and in others not.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, absolutely, and we could see those startups that you were related to at founding. What's happening to them, for example? Maybe some other exits, etc., and that could be related. I don't want to make a pitch for my other paper, but Ana Maria and Ron are here, and we do some of that in that paper, right? Which is what happens when a related startup is acquired? What happens to you? It's a very cool paper. But we could definitely use that as ideas here. That's a great point. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I guess that you got the question many times before on the other papers, right? So what does it imply if we find structures in tags as data, and what does it imply? So don't firms gear this towards this machine learners? I think I had a discussion on it on Twitter at some point. So what does it imply in equilibrium?
No. Right. I think there's more, right. So there's two pieces of that, right? First, it certainly does not imply causality, right? It's not like I go online and write gibberish and now I'm so differentiated I'm gonna raise a lot of money. It implies a comparative static, right? Like what people do in models, which says in equilibrium these two things should relate in this way. Right, you should see the companies that assuming some sort of normal company that look this way to do better, and that's kind of what we're able to do. I think then the other thing you're asking is right, and so that's one piece. The second piece is, are they telling us what we want to hear or something like that, right? Like for example, imagine a VC actually used this technology and then they would write things that score better here or something like that. That's possible. There's a huge literature on the an organizational theory about institutional conformity and kind of how who you are and what you say. So that's a key assumption here, that what you say in your website to your customers at least is somehow related to what you would like to actually be in the market. And I think it's a pretty obvious assumption. It's a pretty realistic assumption. And so I'm happy to run with that one.
Okay, very good. Also happy to answer this question for me because I also get it sometimes. And then there's a question by Timotheus that's about the different types of strategies. Would you expand on that question, Timotheus? Let me see, because I'm not sure what's meant here. Meet you. You should be unmuted now.
Yeah, I can take it if you. Oh, go ahead, Timotheus.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so the strategy can be about orientation on the market, orientation on customers. Like there can be different dimensions of differentiation. Like
absolutely,
and that's my point. Like, can you somehow analyze it or not with your data?
I mean, no. I say the big answer is no, right? I mean, what you're saying is there's so much to strategy that goes beyond market positioning. It's not just differentiation, right? For example, Walmart is following a low-cost strategy, or Southwest, and it's very clear in what they say that is their proposition. So it's not just those where the product has different features, right? Walmart's slogan is always low prices, always, and so you all those kind of things you also get from the marketing materials. But there's so much that goes into strategy, right? And there's corporate scope, and there's et cetera. And if you want to focus on that, you'd have to find the right type of information that includes that. For example, HR strategy, I've seen some work using Glassdoor reviews, which has its pros and cons, but at least that gets you closer to the organization. Here, the website is really about statement to the outside world, to the market, 90%, 99% of the time to customers. And so that's kind of the piece that we're able to capture. If there was more on that, we could definitely try to capture it, but I guess this is relatedness and market differentiation was one clear way. There may be others for sure. Sorry, Uri, go ahead.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, I also wondered a bit about the strategy marketing. So I'm not sure that you if I was a nasty referee in a marketing management journal, I might say, oh, that's a marketing strategy, it's not strategy. So we could also pitch it as a marketing thing, no?
Yeah, no. And the paper talks about market differentiation. I will confess not knowing exactly I have to go back to my readings of, marketing strategy and make sure I find the clear detail of the concept. But it's a good point. And it's definitely about positioning in the market. So if that's
exactly total position and paper on positions, right?
Absolutely.
I think we have to stop here, right, Christian?
Unfortunately.
Yes, thank you very much. That was super interesting talk, and it was a very lively discussion. Thanks to Jorge and all the many discussions here. Thank you also for making this code available. I think this is a perfect practice and very useful for many, at least for me. And I think we should all do that. So I pass on to Christian or Hannes for the final words. Thank you for now from my side.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. This was super, super useful and fun. And thanks for all the comments and questions.
Thanks, Jorge, also from my side. Just a quick announcement before we close. The VIDE seminar continues in 2 weeks. Our next talk will be on April 8th, same place, same time. We look forward to having Julia Cachet with us. She will be talking about social media and newsroom production decisions. So again, very super interesting talk. Until then, we're looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And thanks again, Jorge. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
So feel